The words hit me like ice water while I stood in the church bathroom, my hand frozen on the stall door I'd just been about to open. "Thank God we can finally cut the dead weight loose after today," my son Victor said to someone just outside. "Mom's been bleeding us dry for years, and Betty's tired of supporting her. Once we get the house situation sorted, we can stop pretending to care." The cruel laughter that followed his laugh, the one I'd cherished since he was 3 years old, lodged in my chest like the tip of a needle that would stay there forever. I had arrived early to help with last-minute wedding preparations, my arms full of the flowers I'd spent my own money on because Betty had mentioned they were over budget. My son's wedding day, the day I'd been planning and saving for alongside them for 18 months. The day I'd liquidated one of my retirement accounts to help fund when their wedding loan fell through 3 weeks ago. $28,000 I'd given them, money I'd earned through 43 years of teaching high school mathematics, money that represented security I'd built penny by penny during the lean years after Victor's father died when he was 12. I stayed in that bathroom stall for another 10 minutes, listening to my heart pound against my ribs while pieces of conversations from the past year suddenly rearranged themselves into a pattern I'd been too trusting, too loving to see before. Betty's suggestions that I should downsize to a senior community because maintaining that big house must be so stressful at your age. Victor's new interest in my financial planning, his gentle questions about my will, his casual mentions of how much my house had appreciated in value since I'd bought it in 1987. The way they'd both started treating me like a burden who needed managing rather than a mother who'd sacrificed everything to give her son opportunities. The church filled with guests while I stood there, my reflection in the small mirror showing a 64-year-old woman who looked older than her years, worn down by 2 decades of putting everyone else's needs before her own. My hair, which I'd had styled that morning at a salon I couldn't really afford, suddenly felt like a costume I was wearing to play the role of the grateful mother-in-law, who should just be happy to be included. But underneath that costume, something harder than I'd felt in years was crystallizing, something that reminded me of the young woman who'd put herself through graduate school while working 2 jobs, who'd learned to fix her own car and unclog her own drains, who'd negotiated her own mortgage and built her own financial security without anyone's help. The transformation happening inside me wasn't sudden, it was more like a dam breaking after months of pressure building behind it. For 18 months, I'd been accepting Victor and Betty's version of reality, where I was an aging mother who needed their guidance and support, where my independence was something to be gradually transitioned away from rather than protected. I'd been so focused on being the kind of mother who never caused problems, who always said yes, who made everyone else's life easier, that I'd forgotten I was also a woman with rights and resources and intelligence that didn't disappear just because I'd reached an age where society expected me to become invisible. Standing in that church bathroom, listening to wedding guests arrive for a celebration I'd helped fund, I remembered things about myself that I'd buried under years of maternal self-sacrifice. I remembered negotiating my first teaching contract when I was 23, holding my ground against a superintendent who assumed I'd accept less money because I was young and female. I remembered buying my house as a single mother when Victor was 14, dealing with mortgage brokers and home inspectors and contractors who tried to patronize me until they realized I'd done my homework better than they had. I remembered managing Victor's college applications and scholarship interviews, making financial decisions and strategic plans that had gotten him into a prestigious university with minimal debt. That woman, the one who'd built a career and raised a child and managed finances and made complex decisions for 40 years, hadn't disappeared just because her hair had turned gray and her son had gotten married. She'd just been hidden under layers of accommodation and people-pleasing and misguided attempts to make everyone else comfortable at her own expense. When I finally emerged from that bathroom, I was still the same woman in the navy dress and pearl earrings, but I was also someone else entirely. Someone who'd spent 43 years teaching teenagers that actions have consequences, that you can't solve problems without understanding the variables, that the most important lessons are often learned when you discover you've been working with false assumptions. Someone who'd forgotten her own strength because she'd been too busy being convenient for other people. The ceremony proceeded with all the traditional elements: Victor handsome in his rented tuxedo, Betty radiant in a dress that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, flowers arranged in combinations I'd researched and suggested, music I'd helped them choose, readings I'd recommended for my own wedding 36 years ago. I sat in the front pew where the mother of the groom belonged, smiled at the appropriate moments, dabbed my eyes when Betty's father spoke about gaining a son, and felt like I was watching a performance in which I was both an essential character and completely invisible. But now I was watching with different eyes, seeing patterns I'd been trained not to notice. The way Victor and Betty exchanged glances when her father mentioned the generous support from family that had made the wedding possible, glances that carried smugness rather than gratitude. The way Betty's mother whispered something to her sister that made them both look at me with expressions I couldn't quite read, but that didn't feel entirely kind. The way Victor's best man, during his toast, made a joke about finally having enough money to start adult life properly that got knowing laughter from people who understood references I apparently wasn't supposed to catch. I'd been funding their adult life for 18 months, without realizing it was supposed to be temporary, without understanding that my contributions were being treated as investments in their future, rather than gifts from someone they valued. The wedding I was watching had been partially funded by money I'd saved for my own security, but I was being treated like a guest who should feel honored to be invited, rather than a partner who'd made their celebration possible. During the reception, I moved through my expected role with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing social obligations longer than most of the guests had been alive. I admired the centerpieces I'd helped arrange, complimented the caterer I'd recommended, and made small talk with relatives who asked about my retirement plans, with a kind of gentle concern that made it clear they'd heard something about my situation. Victor introduced me to his new colleagues from the investment firm where he'd been working for 6 months. Men in expensive suits who shook my hand politely and asked what I did for a living in the past tense, as if my working years were automatically behind me because I'd reached an age where my value was assumed to be decorative rather than functional. "Mom's been such a support through everything," Victor told his boss, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that felt rehearsed. "She's helped us so much with the wedding expenses. And she's been so understanding about our need to start fresh as a couple." The words were perfectly chosen, carrying just enough truth to sound generous while completely obscuring the reality of how much I'd contributed and how little choice I'd felt I had in the matter. His boss nodded approvingly, the kind of nod that suggested he understood the implicit message about elderly parents who needed gentle management. "Your son is lucky to have such a supportive mother," the boss replied, his tone carrying the patronizing warmth that men his age often used when talking to women my age. "It must be rewarding to see him settled and starting his own family. I'm sure you're looking forward to a well-deserved retirement after all those years of hard work." The assumption embedded in his comment that my purpose now was to fade gracefully into the background while Victor took center stage as the primary adult in our family dynamic irritated me more than it should have. But it also clarified something I'd been struggling to articulate. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being treated as an active participant in my own life and had started being treated as a supporting character in other people's stories. I listened to more conversations like that throughout the evening, conversations where well-meaning people spoke about my life and my future in ways that assumed my agency was diminishing rather than evolving. They asked about my health as if it were failing, about my living situation as if it were precarious, about my finances as if they were running out. They spoke to me with the gentle kindness reserved for people who were transitioning from independence to dependence, from decision-making to being cared for. What struck me most was how easily I'd started accepting these assumptions myself, how I'd begun to internalize the idea that reaching 64 meant accepting less control over my own life, rather than demanding more respect for the wisdom and experience I'd accumulated. I'd been responding to Victor and Betty's suggestions about my future as if their opinions carried more weight than my own preferences, as if their comfort was more important than my autonomy. The conversation that finally crystallized my anger happened during the cake cutting, when I overheard Betty talking to her maid of honor near the gift table. "The house situation should work out perfectly," Betty was saying, her voice low but not low enough. "Helen's been getting more and more worried about maintaining it, and Victor has been really supportive about helping her think through her options. We're hoping she'll be ready to make a decision by spring, which would give us time to get settled before we start trying for kids." "How big is the house?" the maid of honor asked, and I found myself straining to hear Betty's response while pretending to focus on the photographer's directions for family pictures. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, about 2,800 square feet on almost an acre, Betty replied with the casual precision of someone who'd already done extensive research. "It's in a really desirable neighborhood, and the market is incredible right now. Victor thinks it should sell for at least $600,000, maybe more, if we stage it right and price it competitively." The maid of honor whistled softly. "That's a nice inheritance." "Well, it's not exactly an inheritance," Betty said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "More like helping Helen make practical decisions about her future while ensuring that the family resources are being used efficiently. She doesn't really need all that space anymore, and the equity could provide her with a really comfortable retirement while also helping us get established as a family. Family resources. As if my house, which I'd bought with my money and maintained with my labor and paid for with my salary, had somehow become a family asset that they were entitled to optimize. As if my future living arrangements were decisions that needed to be made collectively, rather than choices that belonged exclusively to me. As if my comfort and security were variables to be balanced against their convenience and ambition. I excused myself before the cake cutting, claiming fatigue that wasn't entirely false, and drove home to the house I'd lived in for 37 years, the house where I'd raised Victor alone after his father's heart attack, the house where I'd hosted his high school friends and helped him with calculus, homework, and celebrated his college acceptance and MBA graduation. The house that suddenly felt less like my sanctuary and more like an asset I hadn't realized was being appraised. Driving through my neighborhood at 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening, I saw the life I'd built from a perspective I'd never had before. The carefully maintained gardens that I'd planted and tended for decades, the windows I'd replaced 2 years ago, the driveway I'd had repaved last spring, the roof I'd had repaired after the storm damage in 2019, all of it representing decisions I'd made and investments I'd chosen and priorities I'd established based on my own values and preferences. None of it had been decided by committee or subjected to other people's approval or chosen because it served anyone else's interests. My house wasn't just a building with appreciated value. It was the physical manifestation of my independence, my security, my right to live according to my own choices, rather than other people's opinions about what would be appropriate for someone my age. It was proof that I'd successfully managed my own life for decades, that I'd made good decisions and careful investments and strategic plans that had created exactly the kind of stability and comfort I'd wanted to achieve. But Victor and Betty were treating it like a resource that was being wasted on me, like equity that could be better utilized by people who were young enough to deserve comfort and security. They were treating my life's work like a problem to be solved, rather than an accomplishment to be respected. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and the kind of clarity that comes when illusions finally shatter completely. The conversations I'd overheard weren't anomalies. They were confirmations of patterns I'd been explaining away for months because the alternative was too painful to acknowledge. My son and his new wife weren't just taking my financial help. They were planning my financial future without me, discussing my life and my resources as if I were already too diminished to have agency in my own decisions. I opened my laptop and began doing something I should have done months ago, researching my actual financial position instead of simply responding to their implied emergencies with whatever they asked for. What I discovered was simultaneously infuriating and empowering. I had been treating myself like a woman with limited resources because I'd been trying to help them maintain a lifestyle that was beyond their means, not because my resources were actually limited. My teacher's pension provided me with $62,000 annually, more than enough to cover my living expenses, with money left over for travel and hobbies. My Social Security would add another $18,000 when I chose to claim it. My 403(b) retirement account, even after the withdrawal I'd made for their wedding, still contained over $400,000 in diversified investments that were performing well. My house was worth at least $600,000, as Betty had accurately researched, and I owned it outright after paying off the mortgage 3 years early. Most importantly, I had excellent credit, good health, and enough life experience to make intelligent decisions about my own future without anyone's guidance or approval. I wasn't the burden they'd convinced me I was becoming. I was a woman with options who'd been behaving like someone without them because I'd trusted people who had reasons to minimize my independence. The math teacher in me was particularly offended by how thoroughly I'd been manipulated into ignoring my own numbers. I'd been making financial decisions based on emotional pressure rather than objective analysis, responding to their manufactured crises instead of consulting my own budget and priorities. I'd been treating their lifestyle upgrades as emergencies that required my intervention rather than choices they needed to fund themselves. Over the next 3 days, I made phone calls to people I should have consulted before making any major financial decisions. My financial advisor, Richard Blackwood, had been trying to schedule a review meeting with me for months, and when I finally called him back, his concern was immediate and professional. "Helen, I've been worried about these large withdrawals," he said carefully during our phone conversation. "The $28,000 you took out for the wedding, the $15,000 you withdrew in March, the $12,000 in January, these aren't normal patterns for your account. Are you experiencing some kind of financial pressure? Because based on your portfolio and your income streams, there's no reason you should be liquidating retirement funds at your age, unless there's an emergency I'm not aware of." Hearing my withdrawal pattern described that way $55,000 and less than a year was like being slapped awake from a dream I hadn't realized I was having. I'd been thinking of each withdrawal as a separate incident, a one-time favor to help Victor and Betty through various crises. But Richard was seeing the pattern I'd been too emotionally compromised to recognize. I'd been systematically depleting my retirement security to fund their lifestyle upgrades. "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," I said. "If I continue making withdrawals at this rate, how long before I've compromised my own financial security?" The pause before his answer told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. "Helen, you've already compromised your security. Your retirement planning was based on leaving that account untouched until you're 70. Allowing it to continue growing while you live on your pension and Social Security. The withdrawals you've made have not only reduced your principal, they've also eliminated the compound growth you would have earned on that money over the next 6 years. If you continue this pattern, you'll be in serious financial trouble by the time you're 75. That conversation led to another with my attorney, Deborah Gold, who'd handled my will updates and estate planning for the past 15 years. When I explained the situation to her, her response was swift and uncompromising. "Helen, you need to understand that what you've described could be considered financial elder abuse, even when it's coming from family members Margaret said during our meeting in her office 2 days later. The fact that they're discussing your assets and making plans around your death while pressuring you for money raises serious legal concerns. But they haven't forced me to do anything, I said. Though even as I spoke the words, I realized how naive they sounded. Financial abuse doesn't require force, Margaret explained, her tone gentle but firm. It includes manipulation, undue influence, and creating false urgency around financial decisions. The pattern you're describing, the sudden interest in your finances, the pressure to help with manufactured emergencies, the discussions about your house and your will, these are classic warning signs that your adult child is viewing you as a resource rather than as a person with rights. Margaret opened a file folder and pulled out a pamphlet I'd never seen before. This is published by the National Center on Elder Abuse, she said, handing it to me. I want you to read through the warning signs of financial exploitation and tell me how many of them sound familiar. I read through the list with growing recognition and dismay. Creating false urgency around financial decisions described perfectly how Victor and Betty had presented their various crises, always with time pressure that prevented me from thinking carefully about my choices. Isolating the elder from other advisors explained why they discouraged me from consulting with Richard or Margaret before making major financial decisions. Gradually increasing the amounts requested captured exactly how their asks had escalated from a few $100s for minor emergencies to thousands of dollars for major expenses. The house situation is particularly concerning, Margaret continued. When adult children begin pressuring elderly parents to sell their homes, especially when they're simultaneously experiencing financial pressure, it raises red flags about undue influence. Your son and daughter-in-law may be creating a situation where you feel like you have no choice but to liquidate your primary asset to maintain family harmony. That phrase stayed with me, viewing you as a resource rather than as a person with rights. For 18 months, I'd been responding to Victor and Betty's financial needs, as if their comfort was more important than my security, as if being a good mother meant bankrupting myself to fund their lifestyle. I'd been so focused on being helpful that I'd forgotten I had the right to say no, the right to ask questions, the right to maintain boundaries around my own financial future. Margaret connected me with a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases, a woman named Linda Rodriguez, who had 20 years of experience helping families navigate situations where trust had been violated. I want to understand exactly what they know about my financial situation and what they've been planning, I told her during our initial consultation. I need to know how deep this goes before I decide how to respond. Linda's approach was methodical and thorough. Financial exploitation often involves extensive information gathering, she explained. People who are planning to take advantage of someone's resources usually do comprehensive research first. They want to know exactly what assets are available, how those assets are protected, and what legal or practical obstacles they might encounter. What kind of research? I asked. Bank records, property records, credit reports, insurance policies, investment accounts, anything that gives them a complete picture of someone's financial situation, Linda replied. They also often research the legal aspects of elder care, looking for ways to justify or legitimize their control over someone else's resources. Linda's investigation took 2 weeks and revealed a level of calculation that staggered me. Victor had been systematically gathering information about my finances for over a year, including making copies of documents during his visits to my house, researching the value of my property through real estate websites, and even contacting my bank to ask questions about my accounts that he justified as helping his aging mother manage her finances. The bank records Linda obtained showed that Victor had called my bank 7 times in the past year, asking about my account balances, my automatic payments, and my banking patterns. Each time, he'd identified himself as my son and expressed concern about my memory issues and confusion about financial matters. The bank representatives had been sympathetic and helpful, providing him with information they wouldn't have given to a stranger, but felt comfortable sharing with a concerned family member. He's been building a case that you're becoming incompetent to manage your own finances, Linda explained when she presented her findings. These phone calls, combined with his documentation of your spending patterns and his research into your assets, could be used to support a claim that you need assistance with financial decisions. But the most disturbing discovery was Victor and Betty's joint savings account, which they'd opened 6 months ago with the stated purpose of setting aside money to help with Mom's future care needs. The account had been funded entirely with money I'd given them for various emergencies. But instead of using it for the purposes they'd claimed, they'd been treating it as their personal savings account for future investments. Linda had been able to trace the deposits and withdrawals through her connections with financial investigators. The $28,000 I'd given them for wedding expenses had gone into this account, along with the $15,000 they'd needed for urgent car repairs and the $12,000 for Betty's medical bills. But the withdrawals told a different story. They'd used the money for a down payment on a new car, for vacation expenses, and for what appeared to be research trips to expensive neighborhoods where they'd been looking at houses. They've been using your money to fund their lifestyle upgrades while telling you they're saving it for your future care, Linda explained. This is a classic pattern in financial elder abuse. The abuser convinces the victim that their money is being used for the victim's benefit while actually using it for their own purposes. Most disturbing was a series of text messages Linda was able to recover through a digital forensics specialist. Messages between Victor and Betty that made their intentions crystal clear. The messages went back 8 months and revealed planning that was both methodical and callous. The wedding money should be enough to get started, Betty had written in a message dated 3 weeks after their wedding. Once we convince her to sell the house and move into assisted living, we'll have enough for the down payment on the house in Westfield and probably enough left over to pay off my student loans. She doesn't need all that space anyway, and the equity is just sitting there. Victor's response had been even more calculating. I've been working on her about the house for months. She's starting to worry about maintenance costs, and I keep pointing out how isolated she is out there. I think if we time it right, we can have her listed by spring. The market is perfect right now, and she'll get at least $400,000 more than she paid for it. That's enough to set us up properly and still leave her with plenty for a nice retirement community. Reading those messages was like discovering that people you loved had been conducting a business meeting about your life, behind your back, complete with spreadsheets and profit margins. They'd been planning my displacement with the same methodical attention they'd given to their wedding planning, complete with timelines and financial projections that treated my home and my equity as assets they were entitled to access. But Betty's next message revealed the depth of their research and planning. I found 3 retirement communities that would be perfect for her. Sunset Manor has a waiting list, but if we get her application in soon, she could move in by fall. The monthly fee is $3,800, which would leave plenty from the house sale for our down payment. Plus, she'd have built-in social activities and medical support, so we wouldn't have to worry about her being lonely or having health emergencies. They'd been shopping for my future living arrangements without my knowledge, making decisions about my life based on their financial needs rather than my preferences. They'd reduced my decades of independence to a logistics problem that needed to be solved efficiently so they could access my resources. Victor's response to Betty's research was both revealing and infuriating. Perfect. The key is making her think it's her idea. I've been planting seeds about how hard it must be to maintain everything, and she's starting to worry about things like snow removal and lawn care. If we keep emphasizing the burden of home ownership and the benefits of community living, she'll probably suggest it herself by Christmas. They'd been manipulating my emotions and my concerns, turning my normal worries about aging into pressure points they could exploit to achieve their goals. Every conversation about house maintenance, Every suggestion about the benefits of community living, every expression of concern about my isolation had been part of a calculated campaign to convince me to liquidate my primary asset for their benefit. The woman who'd taught algebra and calculus for 4 decades, who'd managed her own finances and investments and property for 20 years, who'd raised a son as a single mother and put him through college without anyone's help, was being characterized as someone too diminished to make her own housing decisions. The irony was so sharp it was almost funny. They were treating me like I lacked the cognitive capacity to manage my own life while simultaneously depending on my cognitive capacity to solve their financial problems. But the most revealing discovery was a consultation they'd scheduled with an elder law attorney about helping elderly parents make appropriate housing decisions. Linda had been able to obtain a copy of their consultation notes through her professional connections, and the content was both comprehensive and chilling. They'd been researching legal methods to encourage my transition to assisted living, investigating power of attorney options, and even exploring conservatorship proceedings for situations where elderly individuals resist making practical decisions about their care needs. They weren't just hoping I'd cooperate with their plans, they were preparing legal mechanisms to override my resistance if necessary. The consultation notes showed that they'd presented my situation to the attorney as a case study in elderly stubbornness, describing me as someone who was becoming increasingly isolated and anxious about maintaining her home, but who was resistant to accepting help or making practical changes. They'd asked about the legal requirements for establishing financial guardianship and the process for having someone declared incompetent to manage their own affairs. Your son and daughter-in-law have been building a comprehensive case for taking control of your finances and your living situation, Linda explained when she showed me the consultation notes. They've been documenting your financial decisions, researching your assets, and consulting with legal professionals about methods for overriding your autonomy. This goes far beyond normal family concern. This is systematic preparation for financial exploitation. Over the following weeks, I assembled my own team of professionals, people who understood that I was the client making the decisions rather than a problem to be managed. Deborah Gold helped me restructure my estate planning to ensure that my assets would be protected according to my wishes, rather than other people's assumptions. Richard Blackwood helped me understand exactly how much security I'd compromised by liquidating retirement funds and how to rebuild that security going forward. Linda Rodriguez provided me with documented evidence of every aspect of Victor and Betty's planning, from the financial research to the legal consultations to the timeline they'd established for encouraging my housing transition. Most importantly, I hired a real estate attorney named David Park, who specialized in protecting property rights for older adults. What you're describing is unfortunately common, he explained during our consultation. Adult children often begin viewing their parents' property as an inheritance they're entitled to access, rather than as an asset their parents have the right to control. The pressure to sell, the manufactured concerns about maintenance and isolation, the suggestions about assisted living, these are standard tactics for encouraging property transfers that benefit the adult children more than the parents. David helped me understand my options, which ranged from simply establishing firmer boundaries to pursuing legal action if their behavior escalated. The most important thing is documentation, he said. You need a clear record of what they've been doing and what they've been planning, so if their pressure increases, you have evidence of a pattern of financial manipulation. He also helped me understand the legal protections available to me as a property owner and as someone with the right to make my own financial decisions. Your age doesn't diminish your legal rights, he emphasized. You have the same right to control your property and your finances at 64 that you had at 34. Anyone who tries to pressure you into decisions based on your age rather than your preferences is potentially violating laws designed to protect elderly individuals from exploitation. Armed with professional support and clear documentation, I began planning my response. Not revenge, exactly, but consequences that would match the scale of their betrayal and protect me from future manipulation. I wanted them to understand that they'd miscalculated badly, that the woman they'd been treating as a resource was actually a person with agency and intelligence and the power to protect herself. The opportunity came 6 weeks after the wedding, when Victor and Betty invited me to Sunday dinner to discuss some exciting plans we've been working on. I knew from Linda's investigation that this would be their official presentation of the assisted living proposal, complete with brochures they'd collected and financial projections they'd prepared to show how selling my house would benefit everyone involved. I spent the week before that dinner preparing for what I knew would be the most important conversation of my relationship with my son. I rehearsed my responses, organized my documentation, and consulted with my team about the best approach for protecting myself while maintaining the possibility of future reconciliation if Victor and Betty were willing to acknowledge what they'd done and change their behavior. Deborah Gold helped me prepare a comprehensive response that would establish clear boundaries while leaving room for them to correct their course. The goal is to protect you while giving them an opportunity to choose a different path, she explained. If they're willing to acknowledge that they've overstepped and respect your autonomy going forward, you can rebuild the relationship on healthier terms. If they're not willing to change, you'll have legal protections in place. I arrived at their apartment precisely on time, carrying a folder that contained copies of everything my team had discovered about their planning. I sat through Betty's pot roast and Victor's small talk about his new job, waiting for the moment when they'd transition into their prepared presentation. When Betty began clearing the dinner plates and Victor suggested we move to the living room for coffee, I knew we'd reached the main event. Mom, Betty and I have been talking, and we're concerned about you living alone in that big house, Victor began, his tone carefully modulated to convey loving concern rather than self-interest. We know you've been worried about the maintenance costs and the isolation, and we think we might have found some solutions that could really improve your quality of life. The words were exactly what Linda's investigation had predicted, delivered with the same manufactured concern that the text messages had revealed to be completely calculated. I listened with the detachment of someone watching a performance they'd already seen rehearsed. Betty returned with coffee and a stack of brochures featuring photographs of smiling elderly people in beautifully appointed common areas. We've been researching retirement communities in the area, she said, her voice bright with enthusiasm. That sounded genuine if you didn't know it was part of a campaign they'd been planning for months. There are some wonderful places where you'd have built-in social opportunities and professional care support, and you wouldn't have to worry about things like lawn maintenance and snow removal. I recognized the brochures from Linda's investigation. They were the same ones Betty had mentioned in her text messages, selected not for my comfort but for their reasonable monthly fees that would leave maximum equity available for Victor and Betty's use. The financial aspect is really attractive too, Victor added, leaning forward with the expression he'd used as a child when he was trying to convince me to let him stay up past his bedtime. If you sold the house, you'd have enough to pay for a beautiful apartment in one of these communities and still have money left over for travel and hobbies and anything else you wanted to do. You'd be financially secure for the rest of your life. The irony of him lecturing me about financial security while planning to access my assets for his own benefit was so profound that I almost laughed. Instead, I listened to their entire presentation, which lasted nearly 30 minutes and covered everything from the social benefits of community living to the tax advantages of liquidating property assets. They'd prepared thoroughly, complete with specific facilities they'd visited, cost breakdowns they'd calculated, and timeline suggestions that would allow me to be settled in your new home by Christmas. It was impressively comprehensive and absolutely insulting in its assumption that I would be grateful for their management of my life. Betty had printed out floor plans and pricing information, and Victor had prepared a financial analysis showing how the proceeds from my house sale could be invested to provide me with worry-free income for decades. They'd thought of everything except asking me what I actually wanted or acknowledging that the decision belonged to me rather than to them. When they finished, I opened my folder and placed the first document on their coffee table. It was a copy of the text message Betty had sent Victor about using the wedding money to get started on their plan to convince me to sell my house. "I found this interesting," I said, my voice carrying the same tone I'd used for 43 years when catching students cheating on exams. "It's from your phone, Betty, sent 3 days after your wedding. Would you like to read it aloud, or should I?" The silence that followed was profound. Victor's face went through several color changes, from confused pale to embarrassed red to angry flush, while Betty's mouth opened and closed without producing any sounds. I placed the second document on the table, then the third, watching their expressions change as they realized the scope of what I discovered. "I've been in contact with a private investigator for the past month," I continued, my voice steady and matter-of-fact. "I know about the joint savings account you opened with my wedding money. I know about your consultations with the elder law attorney. I know about your timeline for encouraging my transition to assisted living. I know about your research into conservatorship proceedings. I know exactly how much you think my house is worth and exactly how you planned to use that equity to fund your own lifestyle." Victor attempted damage control with the desperation of someone who'd been caught in a lie too comprehensive to explain away. "Mom, you don't understand. We were trying to help you. We've been worried about your future, and we thought if we did some research ahead of time, we could present you with good options when you were ready to make changes. So you were helping me by planning to take control of my finances and my property without consulting me?" I asked. "You were helping me by researching legal methods to override my decision-making if I didn't cooperate with your timeline? You were helping me by treating my home as an inheritance you were entitled to access while I'm still very much alive?" Betty finally found her voice, though it came out higher and more defensive than usual. "Helen, you're taking this all wrong. We love you, and we want what's best for you. Victor and I have been talking about our future, and we thought it would be wonderful if we could all be more financially secure." "Financially secure," I repeated slowly. "You mean you want to be financially secure using my money and my property while convincing me that I'm too diminished to manage my own life? You want to be financially secure by treating me like a resource you're entitled to liquidate, rather than a person with the right to make my own decisions." I placed the next set of documents on their coffee table copies of Victor's phone calls to my bank, Betty's research into retirement communities, and their consultation notes with the elder law attorney. "You've been systematically gathering information about my finances, researching my property value, and consulting with legal professionals about methods for overriding my autonomy," I continued. "You've been building a case that I'm incompetent to manage my own affairs while simultaneously depending on my competence to solve your financial problems. The contradiction alone should embarrass you." Victor's face had shifted from embarrassment to something uglier, the kind of angry desperation that appears when someone realizes their careful plans are collapsing. "This is insane, Mom. We're your family. We're trying to help you, and you're acting like we're criminals. You hired a private investigator to spy on us? You're talking about legal action against your own son?" "I hired a private investigator to understand what was being planned behind my back," I replied calmly. "I consulted with legal professionals to protect myself from people who were researching methods to override my decision-making capacity. I took the same precautions any intelligent person would take when they discovered they were being systematically manipulated and exploited." Betty's approach shifted to tears, the kind of manipulative crying that had probably worked on Victor, but had no effect on someone who dealt with teenage drama for 4 decades. "Helen, please don't do this. We love you so much, and we never meant to hurt you." Can't we work this out as a family? Can't we find a way to move forward together? We can move forward, I agreed. But we'll move forward with clear boundaries and honest communication. You'll move forward understanding that I'm not available to fund your lifestyle or to sacrifice my security for your convenience. You'll move forward knowing that my property and my finances are mine to control, and your opinions about my choices are irrelevant unless I specifically ask for them. I placed the final document on their coffee table. It was a letter from Deborah Gold, written on law firm letterhead, formally notifying them that any further attempts to pressure me into property transfers or financial decisions would be considered elder abuse and would result in legal action. It also informed them that I had revoked any informal permissions they might have assumed they had to access information about my finances, my property, or my legal affairs. Effective immediately, you are not authorized to contact my bank, my financial advisor, my insurance company, or any other institution that manages my affairs. I informed them. You are not authorized to research my property value, to collect documents from my house, or to schedule consultations about my care needs without my explicit permission. You are not authorized to plan my future or to make assumptions about my decision-making capacity. The room fell silent except for the sound of Betty's crying, which had escalated from manipulative sniffles to genuine sobs as she realized the magnitude of what they'd lost. Victor sat frozen, his hands clenched in his lap, his face cycling through emotions too rapidly for me to catalog them all. There's more, I continued, opening a second folder I'd brought with me. The joint savings account you opened with my money, the one you claimed was for my future care needs, but actually used for your vacation expenses and car payments. That account contains funds that were obtained through misrepresentation. According to my attorney, using someone else's money for purposes other than what you claimed constitutes fraud, regardless of your relationship to that person. Victor found his voice, though it came out strained and desperate. Mom, we never said we wouldn't use some of that money for our own expenses. You knew we were trying to get established as a couple. You knew we had student loans and car payments and normal expenses that young people have. I knew you had asked for help with specific emergencies, I corrected. I was told the wedding money was for wedding expenses, not for your joint savings account. I was told the $15,000 in March was for urgent car repairs, not for a down payment on a luxury vehicle. I was told the $12,000 in January was for Betty's medical bills, not for your vacation to Costa Rica. Betty's crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that felt more dangerous than her tears. How did you find out about Costa Rica? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Bank records, I replied simply. My private investigator traced every dollar I gave you and documented exactly how it was spent. The pattern of misrepresentation is comprehensive and well documented. You've been systematically lying to me about your financial needs while using my money to fund lifestyle choices you couldn't afford on your own. I pulled out a detailed accounting that Linda had prepared, showing the flow of funds from my retirement account to their joint savings account to their various personal expenses. $55,000 over 11 months, I said, sliding the document across their coffee table. Money I thought was helping you through temporary emergencies. Money that was actually funding permanent upgrades to your lifestyle. Victor's desperation transformed into something that looked like panic. Mom, please, you have to understand. We were going to pay you back. Once we got the house situation sorted out, once you moved somewhere more manageable, we were planning to use part of the proceeds to reimburse you for everything you'd contributed. This was never supposed to be permanent. You were planning to reimburse me with money from the sale of my own house? I asked, letting the absurdity of his statement hang in the air. You were going to pay me back using equity from my own property after convincing me to sell that property to solve problems you'd created by spending my money on things you couldn't afford? The mathematical impossibility of his logic seemed to register even with him. because his mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. Betty had stopped crying entirely and was staring at the documents scattered across their coffee table with the expression of someone trying to calculate how much trouble they were actually in. "The elder law consultation is particularly interesting," I continued, pulling out copies of their consultation notes. "You presented my situation as a case study in elderly incompetence, describing me as someone who was becoming increasingly unable to make practical decisions about my own care. You asked about legal methods for overriding my autonomy and establishing guardianship over my finances and my living situation." I read directly from their consultation notes, using the attorney's exact language. "Clients report that elderly mother is resistant to accepting help and making practical changes despite increasing isolation and anxiety about home maintenance. Clients seek guidance on legal requirements for establishing financial guardianship and process for having elderly parent declared incompetent to manage own affairs." "You were preparing to have me declared legally incompetent," I said, setting the document down carefully. "You were researching methods to take control of my finances and my property by convincing a court that I lacked the mental capacity to make my own decisions, while simultaneously depending on my mental capacity to continue giving you money whenever you asked for it." Victor made one final attempt at damage control, his voice taking on the pleading tone he'd used as a child when he'd been caught in serious mischief. "Mom, it wasn't like that. We were just trying to understand our options in case you ever really did need help. We were trying to be prepared for the future, not trying to hurt you in the present." "Being prepared for the future," I repeated slowly. "Is that what you call researching retirement communities without my knowledge? Is that what you call calculating the timeline for my displacement to maximize your access to my equity? Is that what you call lying about how you spent my money while building a legal case for my incompetence?" I stood up, gathering my documents with the same methodical precision I'd used to grade papers for 4 decades. "I want you both to understand something very clearly," I said, looking directly at each of them. "I am not too old to recognize manipulation. I am not too diminished to protect myself from exploitation. I am not too isolated to build a support network of professionals who respect my autonomy. And I am certainly not too incompetent to understand when people I trusted have been systematically betraying that trust." Betty made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Helen, what can we do to fix this? How can we make this right? We never meant for it to go this far, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust. You can start by returning every dollar you obtained through misrepresentation." I replied, "The money you claimed was for wedding expenses but deposited in your joint savings account. The money you claimed was for car repairs but used for vacation expenses. The money you claimed was for medical bills but spent on luxury purchases. All of it, with interest, returned to my retirement account where it belongs." Victor's face went pale. "Mom, we don't have $55,000 just sitting around. That money has been spent on legitimate expenses. We can't just write you a check for that amount. Then you'll need to figure out how to obtain it," I said simply. "Sell the car you bought with my money. Cancel the vacation you planned with my money. Return the luxury items you purchased with my money. Take out a loan if necessary. But understand that until every dollar is returned, you have no credibility with me and no access to my resources." I moved toward their door, pausing only to deliver my final conditions. "You will also provide me with written acknowledgement that my property and my finances belong to me, that you have no legal or moral claim to my assets, and that you will not engage in any further research or planning related to my living situation without my explicit consent. You will close the joint savings account that was opened with my money under false pretenses. And you will provide me with copies of all documents you've collected related to my finances, my property, or my personal affairs." "And if we refuse?" Victor asked, his voice carrying a challenge that suggested he still didn't fully understand the seriousness of his situation. "Then you'll be hearing from my attorney about criminal charges for financial elder abuse," I replied calmly. "You'll be explaining to a judge why you systematically lied to obtain money from an elderly relative while simultaneously building a legal case for that relative's incompetence. You'll be defending your actions in a courtroom where the penalties for financial exploitation of elderly individuals are quite severe." The silence that followed was profound. Betty had started crying again, but quietly this time, the kind of crying that comes from genuine fear rather than manipulative desperation. Victor sat motionless, his face cycling through expressions that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd done and what they stood to lose. "I'm not trying to destroy your lives," I said, my voice gentler but no less firm. "I'm trying to protect my own life from people who demonstrated that they view me as a resource rather than as a person with rights. If you're willing to acknowledge what you've done, make full financial restitution, and commit to respecting my autonomy going forward, we can eventually rebuild some kind of relationship. But it will be a relationship between equals, not between a resource and the people who exploit it." I opened their door and paused on the threshold. "You have 30 days to begin the restitution process and to provide the written acknowledgments I've requested. If you choose not to comply, my attorney will initiate legal proceedings. If you choose to comply, we can schedule a meeting with a family counselor to discuss the possibility of rebuilding trust. But understand that trust, once broken this thoroughly, takes years to repair and requires consistent demonstration of changed behavior." The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt like the end of one relationship and the beginning of another. I had lost a son who viewed me as a convenient resource, but I had rediscovered a woman with the strength to protect herself from anyone who refused to respect her autonomy. Over the following weeks, I began the process of rebuilding my life according to my own priorities, rather than other people's expectations. Richard Blackwood helped me restructure my investment strategy to recover from the withdrawals I'd made, setting up a plan that would restore my retirement security within 2 years if I avoided any further major expenditures. Deborah Gold helped me update my estate planning to ensure that my assets would be distributed according to my wishes rather than other people's assumptions, including provisions that would protect my estate from any future attempts at financial manipulation. Most importantly, David Park helped me establish legal protections that would prevent anyone from pressuring me into property transfers or financial decisions without proper safeguards. "You have the right to make your own choices about your living situation and your finances for as long as you're mentally competent," he explained. "These documents establish clear procedures for anyone who might question your competence in the future, requiring multiple professional evaluations and court oversight before any of your rights could be limited." I also began building new relationships with people who valued my company rather than my assets. My neighbor, Dorothy Richardson, had been inviting me to her book club for months, and I finally accepted her invitation. The group met weekly to discuss everything from contemporary fiction to historical biographies, and I discovered that my perspectives as a retired educator were welcomed and respected. These women, ranging in age from 55 to 78, treated each other as individuals with interesting opinions and valuable experiences, rather than as resources to be managed or problems to be solved. Through the book club, I met several other women who'd navigated similar family dynamics. Patricia Williams had established boundaries with an adult daughter who'd been pressuring her to move to a retirement community so the daughter could access her house for her own growing family. Eleanor Chen had discovered that her son had been researching her financial accounts and had taken legal action to protect herself from further intrusion. Janet Morrison had successfully resisted pressure from multiple adult children who'd wanted her to liquidate her investments to help fund their various business ventures. The common thread, Patricia explained during one of our coffee meetings, is that our adult children started treating us like resources instead of people. They stopped seeing us as individuals with our own goals and preferences and started seeing us as assets that could be optimized for their benefit. Eleanor nodded in agreement. The manipulation is often very subtle. They don't demand money, they create crises that require our help. They don't tell us to sell our homes, they express concern about our ability to maintain them. They don't say they want our assets, they frame everything as being for our own good. These conversations helped me understand that my experience with Victor and Betty wasn't unique, but it also wasn't inevitable. The women I'd met had all successfully protected themselves from financial exploitation while maintaining their independence and dignity. They'd learned to recognize manipulation, establish boundaries, and build support networks that respected their autonomy. I also reconnected with former colleagues who'd been trying to stay in touch since my retirement. Linda Patterson, who taught chemistry in the classroom next to mine for 15 years, invited me to join a group of retired educators who met monthly for dinner and conversation. These gatherings reminded me of the professional identity I'd built over 4 decades, the expertise I'd developed in mathematics education, and the respect I'd earned from peers who understood the complexity and importance of teaching. You know, Linda said during one of our dinners, retirement doesn't mean we stop being intelligent, capable people. It just means we have more time to apply our intelligence and capability to things we choose rather than things we're required to do. That perspective helped me reframe my situation in terms of opportunity rather than loss. Instead of viewing my conflicts with Victor and Betty as evidence that I was becoming isolated and difficult, I could see them as evidence that I was finally prioritizing my own well-being over other people's convenience. 6 weeks after my confrontation with Victor and Betty, I received a certified letter containing a partial response to my demands. They'd managed to return $18,000 to my retirement account, which they claimed represented all the money they had access to without taking on debt. The letter included a written acknowledgement that my property and finances belonged to me, though it was worded carefully to avoid admitting wrongdoing in their previous behavior. We recognize that Helen has the right to make her own decisions about her living situation and her financial affairs, the letter stated. We acknowledge that we may have overstepped appropriate boundaries in our concern for her welfare, and we commit to respecting her autonomy in all future interactions. It was a start, but it fell short of the full restitution and complete acknowledgement I'd requested. The remaining $37,000 was described as temporarily inaccessible due to current financial obligations, with a promise to return it as circumstances permit. The tone of the letter suggested compliance, motivated by fear of legal consequences rather than genuine understanding of what they'd done wrong. Deborah Gold reviewed the letter and advised me that it provided some legal protection but didn't resolve the underlying issues. They're giving you the minimum response necessary to avoid immediate legal action, she explained. But they haven't demonstrated any real understanding of why their behavior was problematic, and they haven't provided the full restitution you're entitled to receive. I decided to accept the partial payment as a first step while maintaining pressure for complete resolution. Margaret sent a response acknowledging receipt of the $18,000 while reiterating that the remaining $37,000 was still owed, with interest accruing until full payment was made. Meanwhile, I began making positive changes to my life that demonstrated my competence and independence. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class that I'd been interested in for years but had never made time for while I was working. I planned a trip to Ireland, something I'd always wanted to do but had postponed because of various family obligations and financial contributions. I hired a landscaping company to redesign my garden, creating outdoor spaces that would be easier to maintain as I aged, while preserving the beauty and privacy I valued about my property. Each of these decisions was made according to my own preferences and priorities, without consulting anyone else or seeking approval for my choices. It was remarkably liberating to remember that I was free to spend my time and money on things that brought me joy, rather than constantly responding to other people's emergencies and expectations. The landscaping project, in particular, became a symbol of my renewed independence. I worked with a designer to create garden spaces that would be manageable for me to maintain while providing year-round beauty and seasonal interest. We installed raised beds for vegetables and herbs, planted low-maintenance perennials that would attract birds and butterflies, and created seating areas where I could enjoy my outdoor spaces comfortably. Victor and Betty drove by my house while the landscaping work was in progress, and I later learned from Dorothy that they'd stopped to ask her what I was doing. Dorothy reported that they seemed surprised and concerned that I was making major improvements to my property rather than preparing to sell it. They asked if I thought you were making good decisions, Dorothy told me with some amusement. I told them that you seemed perfectly capable of managing your own affairs and that the garden improvements were beautiful and well planned. They didn't seem to like that answer. Their reaction to my landscaping project revealed that they still didn't understand the fundamental issue. They were concerned that I was investing money in my home because they still viewed my property as an asset they were entitled to inherit rather than as my personal living space that I had the right to improve according to my own preferences. 3 months after our confrontation, I received a call from Victor asking if we could meet to discuss rebuilding our relationship. His tone was more subdued than it had been during our previous interactions, and he seemed genuinely interested in finding a way forward rather than simply trying to manipulate me into changing my position. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our respective homes, and had the first honest conversation we'd had in over a year. Victor began by acknowledging that he and Betty had made mistakes in how they'd approached their concerns about my future. He admitted that they'd become too focused on financial planning and had lost sight of my right to make my own decisions. I think we started treating you like a problem to be solved, rather than a person whose choices we should respect, he said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine regret. We were so worried about making sure you'd be okay that we forgot to ask you what you actually wanted. It was closer to a real apology than anything I'd received from him since the wedding, but it still fell short of acknowledging the full scope of what they'd done. He framed their behavior as excessive concern rather than systematic manipulation, and he didn't address the misrepresentation involved in how they'd used my money. Victor, I appreciate that you're trying to rebuild our relationship, I replied carefully, but I need you to understand that this wasn't just about planning or communication problems. You and Betty systematically lied to me about how you were using my money. You researched legal methods for overriding my autonomy. You planned my future without my knowledge or consent. Those aren't mistakes, they're betrayals of trust that have serious consequences. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup with an expression I couldn't quite read. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and he looked older than his 32 years. I know we hurt you, he said finally. I know we violated your trust in ways that are hard to forgive. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try. Betty and I have been talking, and we realize that we lost sight of who you are as a person. We started thinking of you as our responsibility, instead of as our family member who deserves respect. It was progress, though limited progress. He was acknowledging emotional harm without fully confronting the financial exploitation, and he was speaking about respect without demonstrating understanding of what respectful behavior would actually look like. If you're serious about rebuilding trust, I said, you'll need to complete the financial restitution we discussed. The $37,000 you still owe me isn't optional. It's money you obtained through misrepresentation, and returning it is a basic requirement for any future relationship. Victor nodded, though he looked pained. We're working on it. We've cut back on our expenses and we're saving everything we can, but it's going to take time. We're also looking into refinancing options and maybe taking out a personal loan to speed up the process. I understand that it will take time, I replied. But I need to see consistent progress and clear commitment to making me whole. You can't rebuild trust while continuing to benefit from money you obtained dishonestly. Over the following months, Victor and Betty made steady payments toward their debt, usually $500 or $1,000 at a time. They also provided me with monthly statements, showing their progress and their remaining balance. It was a slow process, but it demonstrated some level of commitment to making restitution. More importantly, they stopped making suggestions about my living situation or my financial decisions. When I mentioned my landscaping project, Victor simply said it sounded beautiful and asked to see pictures when it was completed. When I told him about my trip to Ireland, he expressed interest in hearing about my experiences without offering opinions about whether traveling alone was advisable for someone my age. The boundaries I'd established were holding, and Victor and Betty seemed to be learning to relate to me as an autonomous adult rather than as a responsibility they needed to manage. It wasn't the warm, close relationship we'd had before, but it was a respectful relationship that acknowledged my right to make my own choices. A year after the confrontation, I'd received $41,000 in restitution payments, leaving $14,000 still owed. Victor had also provided me with a more comprehensive apology that acknowledged the manipulation and misrepresentation involved in their previous behavior. I understand now that we weren't just overly concerned about your future, he wrote in a letter that accompanied one of his payments. We were treating you like someone who didn't have the right to control her own life, and we were using your love for us to pressure you into decisions that benefited us more than they benefited you. That was wrong, and I'm sorry for the ways we took advantage of your generosity and your trust. It was the kind of apology I'd been hoping to receive, one that acknowledged the real nature of what they'd done, rather than minimizing it as a communication problem or excessive concern. Betty also wrote her own letter, addressing her role in researching my finances and planning my displacement. I realize now that treating your house like an asset we were entitled to access deeply disrespectful, she wrote. Your home represents decades of your work and your choices, and I had no right to view it as a solution to our financial challenges. I'm sorry for the ways I participated in planning your future without respecting your autonomy. These apologies, combined with their consistent restitution payments and their respect for the boundaries I'd established, created the foundation for a different kind of relationship. We weren't as close as we'd been before, but we were more honest. They no longer treated me like someone who needed their management, and I no longer felt obligated to prioritize their comfort over my own security. I also discovered that protecting myself from exploitation had positive effects beyond just my relationship with Victor and Betty. Other family members and friends began treating me with more respect when they realized I was willing to establish boundaries and protect my own interests. My sister, who'd been making increasingly frequent suggestions about my need to slow down and accept help, stopped offering unsolicited advice about my living situation when she realized I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. My former colleagues and neighbors began including me in more activities and conversations when they realized I was actively engaged in building my own life rather than simply responding to other people's expectations. The book club invited me to help plan a literary tour of England. The Retired Educators Group asked me to organize a workshop on financial planning for educators. My neighbors began consulting me about community issues because they recognized that I had both the time and the expertise to contribute meaningfully to local discussions. Most importantly, I rediscovered my own sense of agency and capability. For too many years, I'd been defining myself primarily as a mother and a helper, someone whose value came from meeting other people's needs rather than from pursuing my own goals and interests. Protecting myself from Victor and Betty's exploitation had forced me to remember that I was also an individual with my own rights and preferences and dreams. 2 years after the wedding day confrontation, I received the final restitution payment from Victor and Betty, completing the return of all $55,000 they'd obtained through misrepresentation. The last payment came with a card that simply said, "Thank you for teaching us that love and respect aren't the same thing, and that real love requires respect." By then, we'd established a new kind of relationship, based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. They visited occasionally, but they called ahead to ask if it was convenient rather than assuming I was always available. They asked about my activities and interests without offering opinions about whether my choices were appropriate. They shared news about their own lives without implying that I should provide financial or emotional support for their decisions. It wasn't the uncomplicated maternal relationship I'd once thought I wanted, but it was a healthier relationship that acknowledged my worth as an individual rather than just as a source of support for other people. Victor and Betty had learned to see me as a complete person with my own life to live rather than as a resource available for their use. Most importantly, I'd learned to see myself that way too. The woman who'd stood in that church bathroom 18 months earlier, devastated by the realization that her son viewed her as dead weight, had discovered that she was actually the most valuable player in her own life story. She'd learned to protect herself, to build support networks that respected her autonomy, and to make choices based on her own values, rather than other people's expectations. On quiet evenings in my beautifully maintained house, surrounded by my own possessions and my own choices, I sometimes thought about the conversation I'd overheard in that church bathroom. Victor had been right about one thing. After his wedding, dead weight had definitely been cut loose. He'd just been wrong about who was carrying it.